Good evening, everybody. I hope everybody is managing to connect okay. And welcome to another of our, monthly now, TFA webinars for members on a whole range of topics. This is quite an interesting one this evening because we're doing this on a slightly more informal basis rather than a webinar, so we can all see each other and hopefully make it a little bit more of a, not a fireside chat, but a little bit more of an informal. Obviously, the topic this evening is the future farm policy in Wales, particularly focused on the recent white paper. And we're very pleased to be able to welcome James Owen, who's the Deputy Director of Land Management of the Land Management Reform Division for the Welsh Government. And I must admit, as a very much an English farmer, I'm very much looking forward to hearing James, and I'm expecting to be much more up to speed with Welsh agriculture by 8 o'clock this evening. So I'm really looking forward to that. A big thank you also to our sponsors of the TFA webinars, who are Barclays, who are big supporters of the TFA, and we're very grateful for their sponsorship of these events, which they've been doing perhaps for a lot longer than they thought they were going to do, but certainly since last May, June time when we started these off. They were called the autumn webinars, but now we're into the spring. The weather doesn't feel much like that, but apparently we're into summer tomorrow, so that'll be good. So I hope that you'll all find it useful. We will have a question and answer session after the two speakers. So I've already mentioned that James Owen is going to take the floor to start with. And then George Dunn, who many of you will know as our Chief Executive, will make some comments in response to James, and then we'll have some Q&A after that session. So I'm not sure quite what the protocol is for answering a question, but I suspect put your hand up, shout loudly, and I'll do my very best to get you in. So I think without further ado, we will, oh, sorry, I should just mention, just so that you all know, this is being recorded, just so you know. So I think without further ado, we'll go across to James, who's going to tell us about Welsh Agriculture White Paper, the future direction of policy for farming within Wales. So thank you very much, James. Over to you.
Diolch, Mark, and noswaith fawr pawb. Thank you for the invitation to come and join you this evening, and for the opportunity to set out a little bit about our policy and to take some questions. And really grateful for the opportunity always to engage with farmers. We've set out our stall around future farming policy in Wales over a number of years, but as I hope George and perhaps some of you on the call will know, that our approach to designing and developing the policy in Wales has very much been in collaboration and co-design with farmers and their representatives, and long may that continue in my opinion. So this is just another great opportunity to engage with you directly, to hear your views, and to take them back into our future policy thinking back in the government. I thought it would just be helpful if I recapped a little bit about where we are, really, just to make sure that everybody on the call is kind of familiar with the position and how we've got to the position we're at now. I'm going to start though with a bit of a caveat. We've obviously only just recently had the elections for the Senedd in Wales. We have a new government, yes, many familiar faces in ministerial positions, not least the First Minister and my own Minister, the Minister for Rural Affairs, North Wales and Trefnith, Leslie Griffiths. But, it is a new government. And I think it is important to note that, a new government may have, slightly different, objectives, agendas and impetus. So, I'm talking to you 2 weeks basically after an election and that's been formed. So I'm going to give you my best interpretation, I think, of where we are as a government at the moment, but of course ministers will have their own views and their own direction they want to take during the next 5 years of this current Senedd term. But just a recap about really 5 years, I guess, of policy development since the Brexit vote happened. And the response of the Welsh Government very quickly was to come out and start to think about what future farming policy could be like in Wales as we stepped out of the EU, particularly in relation to the Common Agricultural Policy. So hopefully some of you will be cited on the two consultations, the Green Paper consultations that we came out with in 2018 and 2019. So that would be Brexit and our land and sustainable farming in our our land, which led ultimately to the publication of our white paper in December last year. And thanks as always to George and the team at TFA for responding so completely to all of our consultations as part of this policy design process. I think if I just set out really the kind of strategic objectives of what we're trying to do, and then maybe talk a little bit about some of the proposals in a bit more detail, that might help to frame the question and answer session we have at the end. I think the government is really clear that it has 3 strategic objectives that it wants to achieve for farming in the future. Number one, and first and foremost, is around sustainable food production. So ensuring that food production reigns right at the heart, and we have farm businesses that are viable, resilient and productive, and can continue to produce food for the nation, and also export it under the new trade agreements that are coming online as well. So food production is absolutely the heart of our proposals. But alongside that, the government recognised that it needed to take action in relation to the climate emergency. We have now legislated in Wales to achieve a net zero ambition by 2050. And the government is absolutely intent on achieving that objective, and recognising really that farming and farmers themselves can play a vital part in our challenges against the climate emergency. And then third, but certainly not least, would be the nature emergency. So reversing the loss of biodiversity that we've seen in recent years is a strategic objective of the government. And again, recognising that well over 80% of land in Wales is agricultural in nature. There's a huge opportunity for doing more for nature. So climate emergency, absolutely reversing the loss of biodiversity, but sustainable food production at the heart of our strategic objectives for our new proposals. And we've kind of synthesised these proposals in a couple of ways. We've talked about sustainable land management as a principle that we would like to see implemented in Welsh farming in the future. So that's the principle of cultivating and using and supporting the land to deliver multiple objectives, both in terms of food production and agricultural objectives, but also in terms of the ability to sequester carbon, to ensure we have clean air, clean water, and the like as well. So sustainable land management has been the kind of framework that we've designed our policy against. Under which really, I think for us to sit kind of three kind of key things that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve economic resilience. So we want viable, resilient, productive farm businesses that are economically resilient. Supporting rural communities throughout Wales is an absolute key for us, recognising really the benefit that farms, the direct and indirect benefit that farms can have on rural economies. So ensuring that economically viable farm businesses is part of our SLM objective. Alongside that is, of course, the environmental objectives that I mentioned a moment ago. And there's a real opportunity, as I've said, for farming to make a significant contribution to those objectives. And of course, social objectives. And I think not forgetting, the fabric of our rural communities is often built on social capital of farms, of our heritage, of our culture, and of course, our language in Wales, I think is vitally important as well. So trying to make sure that, the policy that we design isn't just looking at environmental, but also the economic and social benefits that are provided by agriculture and farming in the future, not just directly, but indirectly as well to communities, has been integral to our policy development proposals. And within that, and within the white paper, there are many different provisions. So the white paper set out our proposal to bring forward a bill in Wales after the election that's just happened, to introduce legislation that would give Welsh ministers, a range of powers, but predominantly, and I'll talk about 2 of these, predominantly powers to replace the basic payment scheme and the common agricultural policy in Wales with something that was made in Wales. So a policy, made in Wales and fit for Wales, looking to the future. A key tenet of that policy is replacing the payment scheme, the support scheme that's currently in operation. So transitioning away from the basic payment scheme to a scheme which many of you may have heard of, the kind of principle of public money for public goods. So rewarding farmers for the work that a lot of them already do that deliver some of those environmental outcomes that we're seeking. But alongside that, as part of the scheme, really supporting farmers to be resilient and productive businesses by putting in place, a range of interventions of support that help farmers manage, successfully their farm businesses through, what can be quite tumultuous times. The impact of the Brexit trade deals are still being felt, and only in the last 7 days, I guess, we've heard around Australia and the potential impact of trade deals with them. So, from our perspective, making sure that yes, absolutely, in terms of payments to farmers, that we're rewarding them for the social outcomes they're delivering around the environment in the future, we want to make sure that the support government provides is more holistic than that, and can ensure that we have resilient and productive farm businesses as well. So in terms of the Sustainable Farm Scheme itself, we outlined in some detail our proposals on how that might look back in 2019 in our Green Paper consultation, Sustainable Farming Our Land. Yeah, as I mentioned, that would set out, a process where a farmer would effectively come into a scheme via a review of the sustainability of their farm business at the moment. They would agree a plan with government and effectively a contract, which would be, the concept of public money for public goods. So if you see me swiping my finger, it's because I'm on my phone, unfortunately, so my laptop let me down. So the scheme proposals were outlined in 2019, as I say, and if you haven't had a chance to read them, they represent a good position of where we've got to. I'll come back to what happens next in a moment. Many of you, or some of you, may have been aware that we ran co-design sessions in last year as well, where we took the opportunity of engaging around 2,000 farmers in Wales on those proposals in the scheme. So I'd hope maybe some of the members on the call tonight may have been involved in some of those sessions and interested in any feedback, because we felt it was a really good opportunity to engage directly with farmers on the proposals of what the scheme would look like. Another big tenet of our proposals around the white paper are on something that we've framed national minimum standards. So this is a replacement for the cross-compliance regime that currently operates under the Common Agricultural Policy, a regime that we think is complicated, that in some instances is overly punitive, certainly is bureaucratic and can be improved upon. So what we're proposing to do. Sorry, I got some feedback there. I'll try again. I'm not sure if the technology is letting me down here.
Not quite sure what's happening here, but James is busying very hard.
I'm just getting feedback on the line. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we are getting a bit. Yeah, it was running very smoothly, James, up to a minute ago.
Could it be somebody not on mute?
Yeah, I think it's just feedback I'm getting at the moment. I don't know if you can hear me.
I think everybody's on mute, aren't they? It's obviously one of the disadvantages of not being able to sit around a table where we wouldn't get feedback, I guess. Oh. It's taken 15 months to master the technology, but we're still getting issues. So I can see James is moving from room to room.
I tell you what, you couldn't make it up, could you? Hopefully you can hear me again.
That's brilliant.
Oh, good. I'm so sorry for that. I have no idea what happened, but it brought
that's the kind of smart thinking we expect from highly qualified civil servants, James.
Go and hide in their son's bedroom. Yeah, that's what we need to do. So, so serious apologies for that. I kind of lost my train a little bit there. But I was talking around the national minimum standards. So the standards that we would expect to replace cross-compliance, really an exercise for us to simplify and make more proportionate the existing cross-compliance regime that would operate in Wales in the future, taking an opportunity to really look at where there are gaps in that compliance regime, but also opportunities to simplify and streamline it. It's quite a complex picture, we understand, for farmers at the moment, and anything we can do to make that easier certainly is where we're proposing. So that was the second big tenet of our proposals that we've outlined in the white paper. But alongside the scheme and the national minimum standards and the principles of sustainable land management, we also, there's a range of provisions in the white paper, and if you haven't had a chance to read or look at them yet, it's still a published document. It's still available for members to have a read online, but it includes a range of proposals, for example, around forestry, around tenancy, around commons, and a range of powers that we took in the UK Agriculture Act, which was passed last year. So what does all this mean? I think that's probably, maybe a very salient point for us to kind of. I'll just draw this to a close in a moment. But in terms of next steps for a government, we had I think over 1,000 responses to the white paper, consultation responses. We have an independent research company that are currently analysing each and every one of those responses, and will prepare an independent report. We hope to be in a position to publish that before the summer, at the beginning of the summer, really. So hopefully in July. And alongside that, we'd intend to publish the government's response to the white paper. So the government's response to the policy propositions. And of course, setting out really the agenda, the mandate, if you like, for this new government post-Senedd election of how it will take that forward. We've also got a range of evidence products that we'll be publishing. So, if anyone did participate in the co-design sessions, we'll be publishing a report on the co-design that took place last year. I mentioned we engaged around 2,000 mainly farmers in that process. And then we'll be also leading into further engagement over the summer. And, whilst unfortunately it doesn't look likely that most of that will be in the usual shows, we'll certainly be doing our best to engage on, with a wide range of farmers during the summer period, hopefully with better technology experiences than I've had tonight. So where's this all leading to? Well, in terms of the overall timetable, our intention was and remains to introduce a bill into the Senedd to give Welsh ministers the powers to make these changes next year, so in 2022. Following that, and with the usual Senedd processes of going through legislation, we'd hope to receive royal assent for that bill in 2023, which would mean that we'd look to introduce the scheme from 2024 onwards, followed by a period of transition over a number of years where we'd work, again, closely with farmers, providing them support to transition from the current scheme into the sustainable farm scheme that we propose, but also supporting them in terms of understanding the requirements set by the national minimum standards and exactly what that might mean for their farm business. Quite a big agenda. We've got over quite an extended period of time. We in government at the moment are still in policy development phase, and views are therefore really welcomed in terms of both any feedback on the proposals and of course any feedback as we continue to iterate the detail of the scheme. I think the thing that will really interest members, and I haven't unfortunately got an answer to tonight, is farmers always ask me, what precisely do you want me to do and how much are you going to pay me for it? Well, I haven't quite got the answers tonight, but we're hoping to have, we will have the answers to one of those questions later this year, because we do intend to publish the detail of the scheme later this year, which will again go into a co-design phase. It will allow us to prepare the ground, if you like, for implementation, to take views about the actions that we propose farmers to undertake in exchange for payment, and to get some views about, what's the most feasible and the practical way of doing it. And really in that, what we're trying to do, I guess, is to test ideas, to certainly put out the evidence that we believe supports the actions we propose, but also understand, I think, directly from farmers and those who are intrinsically linked to the land, whether there are different ways of doing the same things that we propose, so that we can learn and iterate and develop our proposals. So I think going back to where I began with this, we over the last 5 years, the government has worked hard, I think, to engage farmers in the conversation around this future farming policy in Wales. Our intention is to continue to develop the proposals in co-design and collaboration with farmers, with a view to then introducing change from 2024 onwards. And I think that's probably around 25 minutes, with sincere apologies, and hope to ears.
James, thank you. I think you've coped very well with a bit of technical difficulty there, which has become a bit of the norm, unfortunately, in these times. But I think that's hopefully given everybody a a pretty good overview of what you're thinking, where the government's going, and clearly, in comparison to perhaps what's going on in England, you certainly seem to be giving yourselves a good deal of time to think about how these are going forward. I think probably the thing to do is to move on to let George have a bit of a spin on what you've said and add a little bit from very much a sort of Tenant TFA perspective before we head into some questions. So, George, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, James, for that really helpful overview of where Welsh Government has got to. We are pleased that we have a minister who understands the landscape against which these policies need to be implemented. I think it would have been dreadful to have a new minister in post trying to deliver some of this stuff, given the extent to which Leslie has been engaged in discussions. So we're pleased that Leslie is continuing in post. That doesn't mean that we agree with everything she says, but it's good to have someone at least understands the background. We're also really pleased, James, that the Welsh Government's intention is to have a scheme which brings the issues of environmental management and sound business management and resilience together. And I know that was an aspiration of the government in England, and quite frankly, they've probably failed in their ability to deliver that. So we're going to be very interested to see how you can ensure to keep these two things together, because we very much believe that it's right that the environmental, biodiversity, landscape, water, air issues need to be seen alongside the business, resilience, productivity stuff. So we will be looking forward to working with you as we develop that through the next few years. Your minister has said previously that if this doesn't work for tenants, it doesn't work at all. And we are still concerned in a number of ways about the way in which this is going to work for tenants. And we are particularly concerned for tenants who are occupying on farm business tenancies, who may have very restrictive terms in their agreements or short-term agreements. And I know that the Welsh Government has to date decided not to put in place provisions which would allow tenants on FBTs to object to their landlord's unreasonable refusal to allow them access to the new scheme. So it'll be really interesting to see how you intend to deal with those issues, because we are now talking about almost half the land in Wales that's tenanted being on FBTs, so we need to make sure that those individuals do have access. The other concern about FBTs is around who can get into the scheme. So we'll be very keen to talk to you about active farmer and ensuring that we don't have land leaving the tenanted sector, because that's going to have issues as far as we're concerned for resilience and for sustainability within the sector. And you might have expected me to say this, James, and I know farm tenancies aren't within your bailiwick particularly, although the policy framework overall is. But agricultural tenancies are a devolved matter for Wales, and you don't have to follow England every time there's a policy change in England. Wales can take its own direction if it chooses to do so. We will be certainly looking to see how the devolution powers you have within agricultural tenancies can be used more effectively than it has been to date in order to forward the needs of the tenanted sector in Wales. Just a few more remarks before maybe you comment on what I've said, and then Mark opens the floor for questions. I think some of our members will be disappointed that there is no mention of an exit scheme within current Welsh policy. As you know, in England, DEFRA has just launched its consultation on the BPS lump sum exit scheme. So it'll be interesting just to hear whether there is any thoughts about having some form of provision for that going forward. I also think it's really important that you learn the lesson that happened in England in relation to the transition plan, that we knew what the pain was going to be, but we had no idea what the gain was going to be in terms of the way that the schemes were being developed. So I'm really keen to hear that you're launching the bones of the scheme later in the year, because I think we will want to understand if we're losing the BPS payments, how we can regain those through the new scheme that you are developing. And I think finally, and I'm sure there'll be others who will make this statement later on, with the national minimum standards that you talk about, with the plans for tree planting, particularly within Wales, taking out a lot of agricultural land, and with the dreaded pollution control measures that are being introduced, which are going to, a lot of farm businesses are going to struggle with. What we're concerned about is that we don't drive out domestic production within Wales by the way in which you implement those policies, and then we simply end up offshoring our environmental, carbon, air quality, water quality issues. Welsh agriculture has got a good news story in terms of its ability to show itself to be both green and productive. And yes, there will always be circumstances that you can point to where improvements can be made, and we're up for those discussions. But what we don't want to see is a massive outfall of producers within Wales, and then we simply import stuff produced to standards which wouldn't be acceptable within the Welsh context. So just a few thoughts on what you had to say, James. A little bit of challenge back, I suppose. So any thoughts you have on that would be helpful, and then Mark will, I'm sure, open the floor for questions.
Well, thanks, George. And I think a number of things that respond. I think first of all, around the scheme itself, as I say, we're still at a proposal stage for the scheme. But you're absolutely right that our proposals are around the active farmer and rewarding the active farmer for the action that they take to deliver the outcomes that we're seeking. There is obviously the complexity of different tenancy arrangements that we'll have to. Very much looking forward to working with you in that process to define that eligibility criteria. But it absolutely, your comment is right that it is going to be designed at the active farmer. I think the challenge on thinking, to work through the detail of what the current cross compliance requirements are, and also to be clear about what they will mean for Welsh farm businesses. And I should have said, alongside the white paper, we did publish our draft integrated impact assessment, which assessed, I think, a number of the kind of challenges of introducing the proposals that are outlined in the white paper. But very much a draft, so we're always keen to hear more or gather more evidence wherever possible about the potential impact of these things. But around our strategic objectives, so this is absolutely, our proposals are about a system where agriculture and the environment go hand in glove, that we do them for the social outcomes they're delivering. So it's a combination of those factors we're seeking to achieve, and that's deliberately high aspiration. And I would argue slightly different to the approach taken in England. And indeed we're perhaps out of the traps a little bit quicker than England in terms of some of our policy proposals. But we do think that is achievable. We do think that will give us the best benefit, if you like, in terms of both the economic environment. For us, it is about agriculture thriving and food and farm businesses thriving in Wales, producing food for the nation still, but also delivering some of the have opportunity to deliver some of the big social outcomes that really aren't rewarded by the market at the moment, such as clean air, such as clean water, and clean air, clean water, etc. So, I mean, I think there are challenges in this. It's a complex policy area. It's one where we have a system that has been in operation before actually in the EU in some way. We've set out our agenda of trying to work closely with us directly success, and I think that so proposals in collaboration, as I mentioned, with farmers and farm organisations, and work through those. Just on the final point on farm businesses, absolutely, the white paper proposed that the dispute resolution HAs and not FBTs. I heard your views on that. As I say, we'll analyse those responses and consider the. I know we've got a meeting in the diary to talk soon about it as well.
Thanks, James. Before we go to questions, I guess I would definitely second George's point about the ability of the Welsh government to do things differently to what we're doing in England, and in particular to take a real lesson from what appears to be happening in England, where I think we thought 2 or 3 years ago perhaps that there was going to be much more emphasis on business resilience, the social impact of farming within the rural community, and it may yet not come to pass, but it feels a little bit at the moment that the policy agenda is switching very heavily to environmental gain and quite rapidly away from food production and business resilience and the advantages that good, strong agriculture brings to the rural community as a whole. And I think there's a really good lesson to learn, and it's good that you've got time perhaps to learn that. So it will be interesting to see how you, as a government with those powers, manage to keep that going, and perhaps keep a close eye on what's going on in England, and maybe we'll get it right. But at the moment, it's not perhaps going in the direction we would have liked. Okay, so shall we move on to some questions? I've got a few. Matterton, who's our TFA Cymru chairman, who is on the line, I think. Dennis, are you? Yeah, I know you're on the phone.
Yes, I'm on the line.
Dennis, would you like to ask your questions? I've got them here, but I'm sure you're much better at articulating them than I am.
Okay, can you hear me?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, right. I'll read these out then. First of all, thank you very much, James, for giving your time to come and talk to us tonight. Very, very appreciative. Yeah, 2 questions, and they are connected. Many tenant farmers will be unable to comply with the recently introduced NVZ rules due to barriers in their tenancy agreements. In order to avoid penalties and ensure access to the proposed Welsh Sustainable Land Management Scheme, would the Welsh Government be prepared to exempt tenants from the new regulations until such time solutions can be found? That's question 1. Question 2, most tenancy agreements stipulate that the rented land can only be used for agricultural purposes as defined by the 1947 Agricultural Act. Many of the envisaged public goods eligible for support under the proposed Sustainable Land Management Scheme are non-agricultural in nature and therefore ineligible to tenants. It has been shown that extensively reared livestock in the Welsh uplands have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions in the world, as per HEC's Bangor University report at the beginning of the year. Would the Welsh Government include extensive mixed grazing as a public good within the proposed land management scheme so that all tenants would have at least one option to embrace? And that would be obviously dependent on tenants being able to access the scheme, and to access the scheme, they have got to comply with these new NVZ regulations, which many won't be able to.
Thanks, Dennis. And I've turned the video off because I think the sound was a bit patchy, perhaps. So I hope that's better. So, but I was listening. So I think just on the first point, you'll be aware of the agricultural pollution regulations. The plan is to phase those in over a period of 3.5 years, alongside a package of support to the industry that the minister announced prior to the election. And I know it's one area that government has unfortunately not been able to secure widespread agreement from TFA and other farming organisations on. But the background to it is well rehearsed, so perhaps I won't go into that here. But there are steps that the government is taking around some of the points you raised around dispute resolution and fast tracking regulations through to resolve some of those very issues to ensure compliance. Because we do recognise obviously that in terms of enforcement, it's essential that tenant farmers have the opportunity to comply with the regulations as laid. So I don't, as you know, it's not really, again, within my bailiwick in terms of the detail of the policy, but one of the reasons for phasing it in the way that's been proposed is to give people that, time period to transition to the new regulations and give every farmer that opportunity. and also to enable some of the support that I mentioned to come online as well. In terms of the scheme, yeah, I mean, the actions that we propose in the scheme will need to be available to all different types of farm and farmers. You know, we need to design a scheme that is broad and deep, if that makes sense. So we do have high aspirations for what we want to achieve in terms of those outcomes. But you know, we need to make sure that the scheme is accessible to as many farmers, you know, if not all farmers in Wales, as we possibly can, because, you know, to deliver the outcomes that we're seeking is going to require a real team effort. And I know that may sound a bit cliched, but, you know, government isn't going to deliver this on its own. It's going to rely very much on farmers to be delivering some of the environmental outcomes that we're seeking in exchange for the money, you know, so in exchange for the payment that we've talked about. So it is in our interest to make it accessible to farmers and as broadly accessible as we can. But it's also in our interest, of course, to deliver value for money for the public purse. And, you know, in doing that, what we've been embarking on really is a process of modelling the different range of actions that we might propose under the scheme and trying to assign a value to that, which is based not on income foregone or costs incurred, but on the social value, the value to society of the different actions that farmers develop. So, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of extensive grazeland, the types of actions that we're proposing would include things like, you know, the animal health and welfare actions that farmers can take to ensure that we maintain those high standards. They are around nutrient management, which would, of course, involve action on the land to support, you know, the healthy soils, but also, you know, may deliver ancillary benefits to farmers, such as a reduced input costs. So a range of actions that I think would be accessible to tenant farmers. And you know, I think, you know, as I say, when we publish the scheme later this year, we'd be really interested in the feedback about exactly how those actions may be undertaken on all different types of farm in Wales, in all different areas of Wales, and, you know, particularly the accessibility of the actions to all of those farms as well. Sorry if I may, Mark. There was one point that George made that I didn't come back on, which was a retirement scheme that was announced in England. So just while it's fresh in my mind, you know, George is absolutely right. It's not something we've proposed in Wales at the moment. I think it's fair to say we're going to watch the consultation with England in interest. It may be an area that the minister wants us to do some further work, but at the moment, you know, it isn't something that we're actively proposing in Wales. But you know, no doubt once the consultation finishes in England, we will speak to colleagues in DEFRA around it, and, you know, take representations from industry as well.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James. Dennis, did you want to come back on any of that, or are you?
Well, just very, very quickly, I think the retirement scheme may be necessary, because I think I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm not sure that the tenancy issue is solvable. And the only advice we've been given so far by Welsh Government is to speak nicely to your landlord. And at the moment, that really is the only thing you can do. So if the landlord isn't cooperative, or his agent isn't, I really think the problems are completely insolvable. And the only way you could get round it is if the sustainable scheme is adapted so that it gets around the issues. I don't think the actual barriers to tenancies is at the moment solvable. I'm really worried about it. So maybe you should bring forward the retirement scheme.
Well, I think you've laid down a bit of a challenge to James and the team there, Dennis, to make sure that it is accessible to everybody. So we'll and tenants in particular. And this maybe leads into a supplement or another question we've got here, actually from Gareth. And I see, Gareth, you are on the call. I don't know if you want to ask these questions, or if you would like me to ask James on your behalf. I'll take that silence as I'll ask them on your behalf. So James, Gareth asked, and this probably plays in a little bit to what Dennis has just mentioned there. Gareth is a member from Carmarthenshire. He says, could a tenant on an AHA tenancy enter the new schemes without the landlord's consent? And if, for example, carbon trading became a lucrative and suitable option, would the tenant be able to do this, as technically it's not agriculture? George may want to come in on this as well, perhaps, but I'll go to you, James, first.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, you know, the eligibility for the scheme is something that we're still working through. You know, I think you know, the consent issue is something that hasn't been raised with me before. So we'll take that back to the policy team and have a conversation around it in terms of the scheme design that we'll publish this year. And perhaps, George, we could pick that up offline as well, so we can understand the issue a little bit more that those on AHA tenancies may experience. I think in terms of carbon trading, I think it depends. So at the moment, what we've proposed is that actually the payment would come from government. So there'd be a payment for government for the actions that farmers undertake. Yeah, in the future, I think it's highly possible, probable even, that carbon trading schemes may take off. So an ability for businesses, and particularly farm businesses, potentially to sell their carbon to either other farms or other parts of industry. We are kind of watching that with interest, of course. It is taking off in some parts of England and indeed the world. But at the moment, I think, just to kind of assure you what the scheme is proposing, that is for the actions that are undertaken on the farm, it's the government that would pay you, not a third party. So that's where we are at the moment.
And Mark, if I might just interject, as you suggested, I might. I think we just need to understand that there are two levels within which consent operates here in terms of tenancies. So there is the consent that is necessary due to the terms of the tenancy itself. So we can put it quite bluntly: if the tenancy agreement says you shall not enter the sustainable land management scheme without the landlord's consent, then the tenancy will hold sway in terms of the consent required for that tenant to go into the scheme. There may be other types of restriction, as Dennis has alluded to, which may require tenants to seek the consent of their landlords under the terms of the scheme. There's then another type of consent, and quite often in the past, we have seen government schemes require tenants to get landlords' consent, even if they don't need it under the terms of the lease. And sometimes that's because of the longevity of the scheme, or just concern about the way in which the scheme operates. Our view within the TFA is that there is absolutely no reason why the government should be imposing a generalized requirement for landlords' consent, because the terms of the lease will determine the extent to which the tenant needs consent. So don't complicate it by requiring every tenant to have consent. Tell every tenant, you've got to look at your lease, talk to your landlord, and seek whatever consent is necessary. Now, as we've been talking about earlier, those within AHA, with AHA agreements, will have the ability to object if their landlord unreasonably denies them access to a scheme. We don't have that luxury for FBTs, and that's something we're talking to James and his colleagues about. On the carbon point, for tenants, we need to think about this a little bit more deeply than perhaps an owner-occupier would, because there are certain things which the landlord will reserve for themselves in a tenancy. So, for example, trees are one of the most common reserved items within a tenancy. And that means not just the trees themselves, but the carbon within those trees. So if you want to enter a scheme with government, which is about carbon sequestration and carbon storage, and actually the tenancy agreement precludes you from having access to those trees, then you may not have the same ability to comply with the scheme rules as an owner-occupier might. So there's a lot of this sort of detail, James, that we will need to be talking through with you and your colleagues to make sure that the tenants do have access. So it seems like a very simple question, but there's quite a lot of detail behind it.
Yeah, I agree, George, and I think that's exactly the type of conversation around eligibility and actions that we need to have. I perhaps just to reiterate though that it is the active farmer that we're rewarding. So in the example that you just talked about, where the tenant farmer couldn't have access to the trees, then without active management of those, and of course there would be no payment to be made from government. So that is what we're seeking here. Both woodland creation and woodland management as part of the scheme. So I think how we work through some of those issues you just outlined as part of that eligibility consideration is going to be vitally important to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks, George. And I think what we're certainly seeing with all of these changes is that as we go forward, there does need to be a bit of a mindset change probably on behalf of, to a degree, tenants, certainly landlords, and certainly landlords' agents, as to how these new schemes are operated in the new regime. Because under the old basic payment scheme, it was pretty straightforward. It was an annual payment for occupying a piece of land. But the whole new environment that we're heading into now is way more complex. And in order to get the best economic and environmental benefit out of this, I think we're going to need to see a lot more close collaboration between landlords and tenants to deliver what the public and governments really need. Just move on to a second question from Gareth, then I'll open it up to the floor. Gareth asks, when the current schemes end, do the habitats created still exist, or could the tenant do as they wish with the land, or does an environmental impact assessment have to be submitted?
Yeah, I think the simple answer, it will depend obviously on what has been undertaken, what action has been undertaken on the farm. I'd just come back to what we're proposing though. So, we are proposing to transition from one scheme to the other. And by the end of that transition period, we'd like to see everybody, hopefully as many farmers in Wales as possible, being part of the scheme and undertaking actions on the scheme. So where habitats have been created, actually one of the actions we might propose to pay farmers for in the future is the ongoing management of that habitat. So, and we would again recognise the social value of that, not just any income foregone or costs incurred type of model. So actually maybe in the farmer's interest to maintain that habitat, or to even to extend that habitat, or to create a corridor to another habitat on their land, because that would actually reward them for, the ongoing management of it and that creation. So, so I think it would very much depend in terms of whether an EIA was made based on the nature of what had been created during the farm. But, I think certainly what we would hope to do would be provide an incentive for farmers to maintain and look after and maintain that habitat as part of the scheme.
Okay, thanks, James. Okay, so have we got any questions from the floor? I think probably the easiest thing is if you have a question, if you want to just raise your hand. I think I can see everybody. So Helen has a question. Helen.
Can I ask, is there a minimum size of land that will be eligible for any of the new schemes within Wales?
There will likely be, but we haven't determined eligibility as yet.
Thank you.
We've obviously got the current BPS eligibility, but we're keen to, as I say, engage as many farms and farm types in this scheme as possible. So that is something that we haven't determined. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Helen. Has anybody else got any questions they want to pose to James? Yes, Elwyn.
Yeah.
You came off mute and then you went back onto it. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. I have two things really. This national forest that they're plans for, it's absolutely massive. And somebody told me the other day that they'd worked out the average, with the average size of farm in Wales, that the national forest would put 3,700 farms out of business. So is there an impact assessment being made on the allied trades that rely on the farming, like abattoirs, auctions, supply people, things like that? Because it's bound to affect, that and these schemes are bound to affect the amount of food we produce.
Thanks, Elwyn. So I think that's possibly a misnomer about the National Forest. So just in terms of the policy on that, that's largely looking at the moment, classifying certain types of forestry in Wales as of such a standard to be part of that National Forest, and then looking at further opportunities for extending that where there are existing opportunities to do that. It's not looking in any way, shape or form to put farm businesses out. And indeed in our scheme, what we're looking to do is integrate really things like tree planting into the viability of that farm business. So, looking at areas of land which is perhaps less productive or not perhaps as useful to the farmers as other parts of land, and then looking at opportunities for woodland creation in that space. And that could be, that could be woodland corridors, and it could be in certain parts. So, it's a challenging target, no doubt, about tree planting, but it's not a climate emergency for no reason, I guess. The challenges that we face if we don't act in relation to the climate emergency is so significant, and the benefit, obviously, of carbon sequestration and the planting of trees is one thing that we're very keen to push through the scheme. Sorry, on your point on the impact assessment, absolutely, the economic impact assessment of the scheme will be considered in the round and indeed published. So we'll publish that. We intend to publish that next year, and certainly in advance of introducing the bill into the Senedd.
Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. Did you have a second? Did you say you had a couple? No.
Well, yeah. Well, it's just that all of this. The sort of de-producing us, like obviously there'll be less food being produced in Wales. It's just worrying me that that we're gambling that other countries can supply that to us. We're losing our food security because of it. Other countries, arid countries, can have droughts. They can have their whole crop disappear overnight over the growing season, and we're just gambling with our food security.
Yeah, I absolutely understand the concern there, and George's point about offshoring our carbon impact is equally valid, and it's something we're obviously very conscious of. And it's why I said, at the beginning, I'll come back to it. We are not looking at we're not trying to design a scheme, an environmental scheme, to just impose farmers and turn them into carbon farmers. We are looking at food production to work alongside that, and we believe that is possible. So there are people out there who might suggest that otherwise, but we believe that the best solution for Wales is a scheme that delivers both economic and environmental outcomes, and that we believe the role of government is to support farmers in continuing to farm the land for the best of both of those worlds. But it isn't going to be without challenge. I would absolutely accept that point.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks, James.
Mark, can I just come in on that point? Just to reiterate what I said about offshoring, because I think that the concern that we have, James, is a genuine one about the fact that if you look at the carbon emissions from agriculture within Wales, it's about 10% of the total carbon emissions that come from Wales, but that's covering 80% of the land within Wales in agriculture. It's the other 20% of the land is producing the 90% of the carbon emissions within Wales. And what our members feel is that they're being scapegoated by being required to plant trees, come out of livestock in order to mop up the problems of the rest of the economy. And then we have the issue then of people simply offshoring that by importing stuff from abroad, where we know the carbon footprint of international agriculture is 25% of total emissions. So it's really, really, really important that we think about these as a system. And one of the things that we don't think is happening at the moment is the Climate Change Committee is certainly not thinking about these things systematically. What we don't want to have is a Pyrrhic victory that we simply plant some trees, but we don't really deal with the root problem.
Yeah, I think it's a fair kind of challenge for us in government, and I would say that the proposal that we've put out around our future scheme is not entirely aligned with that of the recommendation, the pathway proposed by the Climate Change Committee. It does recognise, I think, that there are wider challenges around food production and the nature emergency that we are seeking to address, and therefore, proposes to do something different in Wales. But it isn't an easy problem to solve. I come back to the point you made there, George, which I think is well made, about the credentials of Welsh produce and the fact that they score incredibly well in terms of the overall emissions globally, as evidenced by the Hubby Key Cymru report that was published recently. And we're very keen that we don't just offshore effectively our food production to other nations who are not producing food sustainably, because Wales needs to make a global contribution to this, which doesn't mean just doing our little bit and then importing everything else in. And that is genuinely something that ministers are very conscious of in terms of trying to get the balance right between the proposed scheme, the outcomes we're seeking to generate, and of course continuing to support farmers to farm and produce food sustainably.
Thanks, James. Does anybody else have a question? I know quite a few of you are off camera. I don't know if you wanted to switch your mute off if you've got a question. We've got a minute or two left probably.
Good evening.
Hi, Richard.
Yeah, Richard Ellis, North Montgomeryshire. What is just a question about the budget this year, next year, and for future years, please?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Good reminder, actually. I'd forgotten to mention that. So this year, the Minister announced prior to the election that the BPS budget would be capped at the same rate it had been previously. So, BPS as is effectively in 2021. Ministers also announced that her intention to retain BPS next year. That will be, though, subject to decisions made by the UK government on agricultural spending. So whilst the UK government have said that they will ring fence agricultural spending during the lifetime of this UK Parliament, you may have seen a little bit of a spat in between the Welsh and UK governments around Christmas, where we would argue that we didn't actually receive the amount that we would have expected had we received in the EU. So we are to some extent beholden to the UK government's budget allocation for the money that will be available in Wales. But those commitments have already been made by the previous government around BPS this year, and intention to maintain it next year. I think looking further ahead, it's really difficult to predict. So whilst the UK government have made that commitment for this Parliament, who knows what the position will be, after another UK government election. And similarly in Wales, and I think this is a challenge for us all here, is we need to be demonstrating that that we're really delivering social outcomes and value for money for the taxpayer in terms of the spend that government gives to farming and agriculture sector in Wales in the future. And that's one of the reasons why quite excited by our propositions to be able to demonstrate really the difference that it's making against those nature and climate emergencies. So whilst I think we've got some short-term certainty, I think it wouldn't be fair of me to kind of comment on the longer term, because it will be beholden first of the UK government, and then certainly in the short term, we've tried.
I think we may be having a couple of little technical issues, James, again.
Apologies. I hope you caught that.
That's better. Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the key thing we really all have to recognise, having left the EU, is we are now having to fight with every other department to get money out of Treasury, and DEFRA have had 40 odd years of not having to do that. So I think they've got a lot of learning to do to be able to lever money into agriculture and the environment to ensure that there is a sustainable budget going forward. And we need to recognise that when we are thinking about what the public money is for public goods, because that will massively impact on the medium to long-term support of agriculture, I think. Okay, I'm really conscious of time as ever, and as with most things, everybody has a certain level of concentration when you're staring at screens and listening to people over the technology. So I'll draw things to a close. I think a big thank you to James for coming and speaking to us this evening. It's been really interesting, very useful to see the direction of travel, and I think probably all of us wish you the best of luck in delivering for tenants and the wider agricultural community in Wales, and I really hope you can make this work, and similarly in England and Scotland and Northern Ireland, I guess. So thank you very much, James, for coming along, and thank you very much for battling with your technology. I thought you did very well. It's really hard to concentrate on what message you're trying to give when you're conscious of technology playing its part. So thank you very much for that, James. And also, as ever, thanks to George for his valuable contribution. I'm sure all of you will be very pleased to have George on our side in discussions with any of the governments, and the knowledge that we have from George and the team at head office is always really well appreciated. So, just to say thanks again to Barclays for sponsoring the webinars, and a reminder to those of you who are interested that our next webinar is scheduled for the 24th of June, which is a Thursday, and we're lucky enough to have Janet Hughes, who's head of the Future Farming Policy in England, or UK maybe, George, even England, I think. So she's going to be coming to talk to us about what James has talked to us tonight about in Wales. So that will be nice to hear from Janet. So that's the 24th of June, same time, 7 till 8. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. And thank you all very much for attending. And thanks again to James.
Diolch. Thanks, Mark, and apologies for the technical issues.